Taking this job felt like a lifeline when I had no other options left. A bitter divorce and a long stretch of unemployment had drained me, and the idea of escaping into the wilderness seemed perfect. No distractions, no people, just me, the trees, and the night sky. The forest was vast, an expanse of dark pines and towering oaks stretching farther than the eye could see. When I arrived, the ranger who handed me the keys barely said a word. He just stared at me with tired eyes and thrust a folder into my hands. "Read these rules carefully," he muttered, before driving off without so much as a goodbye. The rules were strange. I settled into the cabin, flipping through the folder under the dim glow of the single overhead bulb. Some rules made sense. Keep the firewood stocked. Report any illegal hunting. Others, though, Rule 4. Do not leave the cabin after 3 a.m., no matter what you hear. Rule 7. Do not look toward the northern tree line after midnight. It felt more like folklore than protocol. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to local superstition. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, a sturdy wooden outpost with a single room, a tiny bathroom, and a small balcony overlooking the eastern forest. On my first night, I stepped outside to take in the view. The stars were brilliant, scattered like shards of ice across a pitch-black sky. The wind whistled softly through the trees, carrying the occasional creak of branches. It was peaceful, or so I told myself, but there was a weight to the air, something I couldn't quite name. I glanced at my watch. 11:57 p.m., almost midnight. My gaze shifted north, to the darker patch of trees the rules had warned me about. They looked no different from the rest, just a cluster of shadowy silhouettes against the horizon. Still, I didn't linger. The first few nights were uneventful. I settled into a routine, making rounds just before sunset, jotting down notes in the logbook, and keeping an eye on the perimeter. The isolation was a welcome change at first, though the silence felt heavier than I'd expected. On my third night, I began to notice it. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Even with no wildlife in sight, you'd think there'd be rustling leaves or the occasional chirp. Instead, the stillness felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath. At around midnight, while scanning the treetops with my flashlight, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker, fast and low, like something darting between the trees. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand as I swung it toward the northern edge of the forest. There was nothing there, just rows of dense trees swaying gently in the breeze. The folder's rules flashed through my mind. Do not look toward the northern tree line after midnight. Shaking my head, I muttered to myself, superstitions, just shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds began. Faint at first, branches snapping, leaves crunching, as if someone or something was walking just outside the cabin. I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft knock at the window. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, and for a moment I considered pulling them back. Don't break the rules. I repeated the phrase in my head like a mantra, and stayed rooted to the bed. The knocks came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Then silence. The next morning, I stepped outside to investigate. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints or broken branches in sight. But near the northern edge, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint trail of what looked like scratches carved into the bark of several trees, all leading deeper into the forest. Later that day, I found the logbook tucked in the drawer of the small desk. It wasn't part of the official materials, but the handwriting inside was old and hurried. The entries were brief. Do not break Rule 4, no matter how curious you feel. The northern edge isn't safe. It sees you if you look too long. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. If you hear it knock, it's already too late. The nights after the knocking incident were anything but peaceful. The sense of isolation that I'd initially welcomed had shifted into something oppressive. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind, felt deliberate, as though the forest itself was watching me. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, but then the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop. It started just past midnight. I was sitting at the desk, absently jotting down notes about the forest's eerie quiet when I heard it. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My pen froze mid-stroke. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was out there. Gripping my flashlight, I crept to the window and peered through a sliver in the curtain. Nothing. Just the faint outlines of trees swaying gently under the moonlight. The steps continued, circling closer, and then stopped directly at the front door. My pulse thundered in my ears. I debated whether to grab the rifle stored under the bed, but the rules flashed through my mind again. Do not leave the cabin after 3 a.m., no matter what you hear. A long, tense silence followed. Then, a single knock. Not on the window this time, on the door. I didn't move. The knock came again, firmer this time, and then the door handle rattled. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were trying to get in. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking in the stillness. The rattling stopped. For a moment I thought it was over. Then, from somewhere near the northern tree line, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but distorted, as if layered with something human. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I forced myself outside to investigate. My boots crunched on frost-covered grass as I circled the cabin. Near the door, I found it. Deep gouges in the wood, like claw marks. Whatever had been there wasn't human. The trail of scratches I'd seen earlier near the northern edge now seemed more deliberate, almost like a path leading deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trees grew denser as I moved farther from the cabin. The air felt heavier, colder. After a few minutes, I came upon a clearing. In the center was a large jagged rock with strange symbols etched into its surface. Surrounding it were piles of broken branches, arranged in crude, circular patterns. I crouched to examine one of the symbols on the rock, running my fingers over its rough surface. The lines were uneven, almost as if they'd been carved in haste. That's when I noticed the silence again. No birds, no wind, nothing. A sudden crack of a branch behind me made me whirl around. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, catching something reflective. Eyes. Bright, gleaming eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. When I aimed the light again, the eyes were gone. Back at the cabin, I opened the logbook once more, desperate for answers. Most of the entries were disjointed, filled with frantic warnings about the northern edge and vague references to something older than the trees. One entry stood out. The symbols are a ward. If they're gone, we're all in danger. The words burned into my mind as I flipped to the final page, hoping for more. What I found instead made my stomach turn. They only knock if they know you're breaking the rules. By the time night fell again, the tension in the cabin was suffocating. The rules had been clear. Don't look toward the northern tree line. Don't leave the cabin after 3 a.m. But now, every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that the rules weren't just arbitrary. They were a warning, and I was going to break them. It started with the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the door. I froze where I stood, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. The knocking stopped, but the footsteps began again, circling the cabin. This time, they were heavier, like whatever was out there wanted me to know it was no longer hiding. I told myself I'd just opened the door a crack, just enough to get a glimpse. The rational part of me screamed not to do it, but curiosity had its claws in me now, and I couldn't stop. I unlatched the door slowly, the creak of the hinges loud in the silence. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin. At first, I saw nothing. Then my light caught movement at the edge of the northern tree line. A figure stood there, tall and gaunt, its shape barely human. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze pierce me, freezing me in place. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and backed away, but it was too late. The logbook had mentioned a path of scratches near the northern edge, so I knew where I had to go. Grabbing the rifle and the flashlight, I forced myself to step outside. The forest was alive with a sinister energy, the shadows shifting unnaturally under the moonlight. The path of scratches led me deeper into the woods, and the further I went, the colder it became. My breath formed clouds in the air, and my fingers went numb around the flashlight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of my boots on frozen leaves. When I reached the clearing, the jagged rock stood out like a monument to something ancient and malevolent. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Surrounding the rock were the broken branch circles I'd seen earlier, but now they were disturbed, as if something had smashed through them. I stepped closer, and the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like a low hum that I felt in my chest more than I heard. Then the humming grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. The figure from before emerged, but it wasn't alone. More shapes followed, their forms twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. Their glowing eyes locked onto me, unblinking. The hum turned into a deafening roar. Panic surged through me as I raised the rifle, aiming blindly at the approaching figures. My first shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The creature at the front staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural, inhuman sound that sent ice through my veins. The others began to close in, their movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. One of them reached for me, its elongated fingers brushing against my arm. The touch burned, searing through my jacket and into my skin. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around me. The rifle was useless, and the flashlight began to flicker. Finally, I saw the cabin's faint outline in the distance. I threw myself through the door and slammed it shut, bolting the lock. My arm throbbed where the creature had touched me, the skin red and blistered. As I collapsed onto the floor, the knocking started again. This time, it didn't stop. The knocking was relentless. Every strike against the wood felt deliberate, as if whatever was outside knew it had my full attention. I pressed my back against the cabin wall, clutching the rifle, though I knew it wouldn't help. The cabin wasn't safe anymore. The door rattled in its frame, the hinges groaning as the pounding grew stronger. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A voice. It wasn't quite human. It was layered, overlapping, as though several people were speaking at once. "Open the door," it rasped. My hands trembled as I aimed the rifle toward the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Stay back," I shouted, but the voice only laughed, a guttural, distorted sound that echoed through the cabin like a mocking chorus. The laughter faded, and the silence that followed was worse. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was over. Then, I heard it again. Movement, but this time from the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps creaked above me, circling slowly. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening, and I felt the temperature in the room plummet. The rules. Stay inside. Don't leave after 3 a.m. But the rules hadn't prepared me for this. The footsteps stopped, and the cabin grew eerily quiet. That's when I made my mistake. I stepped closer to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was out there. As I pulled the curtain back, a face appeared, if you could even call it a face. Its features were stretched and distorted, the eyes glowing like hot embers, and its mouth split unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The creature let out a piercing screech, and the door burst open, splintering against the force. I raised the rifle, firing blindly, the shots deafening in the confined space. The thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it surged forward, its elongated limbs reaching for me. I scrambled backward, my shoulder slamming into the desk, and grabbed the logbook in desperation. Flipping through the pages, I searched for anything that might help. One entry caught my eye. The symbols are the only barrier. Without them, it can enter. My mind raced back to the clearing, to the rock covered in those strange carvings. The barrier had been broken. The symbols were my only chance. I bolted out of the cabin, the cold night air stabbing at my lungs. Behind me, the creature howled, its voice reverberating through the forest like a wave of static. The path to the clearing was treacherous, branches clawing at my face and arms as I ran. When I reached the rock, I saw it clearly now. The symbols were glowing faintly, but several had been scraped away. The circles of branches were scattered, their protective patterns disrupted. The hum I'd felt earlier returned, growing louder as the creature closed in. Its glowing eyes appeared at the edge of the clearing, followed by its twisted form. I dropped to my knees, grabbing a sharp rock from the ground. I didn't know what I was doing, just that I had to restore the symbols somehow. My hands worked frantically, carving into the stone, mimicking the patterns as best as I could. The creature lunged. At the last second, I finished the last line. A burst of light erupted from the rock, and the creature let out a blood-curdling screech. It writhed, its body distorting and twisting, before it was sucked back into the shadows, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving. The forest was still again, the air heavy but calm. For now, I'd survived. When I stumbled back into the cabin, the door hung loosely on its hinges and the interior looked like a war zone. The desk was overturned, pages from the logbook scattered across the floor. The rifle, now useless, lay discarded in the corner. My arm still burned from where the creature had touched me, the blistered skin a vivid reminder of how close I'd come to dying. I collapsed into the chair, the adrenaline ebbing just enough for exhaustion to creep in. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that whatever force I'd unleashed was contained again. But the forest had other plans. I turned back to the logbook, hoping to find answers. A fresh entry stared back at me, written in the same hurried, erratic hand as the others. My blood ran cold as I read the words. "You've marked yourself. It will follow you now." The words blurred as my vision swam. I slammed the logbook shut and stumbled to the window, scanning the tree line. The forest looked calm, but I knew better. The creature, or creatures, weren't bound to the clearing anymore. I realized the truth then, as certain and sharp as the pain in my arm. The rules weren't just about protecting me during my time in the cabin. They were meant to keep the cabin safe long after I was gone. But I had broken them, and now I'd become part of the cycle. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door, rifle in hand, knowing it wouldn't help. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I felt no relief. If anything, the daylight only served as a cruel reminder. I might escape the forest, but I would never truly be free. Months passed before anyone returned to the cabin. The new recruit arrived just before dusk, his pickup truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the clearing. He looked young, probably mid-20s, with the eager, naive energy of someone who thought this job was going to be an adventure. The ranger handed him the same folder I'd received, with the same worn-out list of rules. "Follow these to the letter," he said, his tone grave. The young man nodded, barely glancing at the contents before tucking them under his arm. Inside the cabin, nothing had changed. The rifle leaned against the wall, the desk had been straightened, and the logbook sat waiting in the drawer. It looked almost welcoming. Almost. But as the new recruit settled in, something caught his eye. The logbook wasn't blank, like it should have been. Instead, the first few pages were filled with frantic scrawls. He flipped through them, the words growing more erratic, more desperate. "It watches from the northern edge. Do not answer the door. The rules are to protect you. Do not break them." And then, on the last page, my name. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, beneath it was the date of my final entry. Months ago. The recruit frowned, closing the book. He set it back in the drawer, dismissing the warnings as the ramblings of a paranoid predecessor. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest grew still. Somewhere beyond the northern tree line, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods, carrying on the wind until it reached the cabin. The young man paused, tilting his head, but then shrugged it off. The knocking would begin soon.